Turning Tides is an AntiKs Entertainment affiliate. You can find us on social media at The Turning Tides Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and at Turning Tides Pod on Twitter. For more information, or if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, please contact us at theturningtidespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Warning. This episode of Turning Tides contains depictions of war, murder, violence, and rape.
The election of Luis Ferre marked the end of the PPD's era in Puerto Rico. Since then, elections have been a toss-up, with either side garnering more support depending on the year. This lack of political stability foreshadowed a problem that began to pervade all aspects of Puerto Rican life. Media on the island and in the United States now portrayed Puerto Rico as a crime-ridden island, in which much of the population was unemployed or barely surviving on Social Security checks. People on the farthest ends of the political spectrum were radicalizing once more. These young people pushed for reform within the universities and challenged societal gender roles, as well as the island's political relationship with the United States. The gap between political ideologies would only widen more severely into the modern day. Generally, young people in urban areas supported the NPP, or the New Progressive Party, while older rural citizens supported the PPD, or the Popular Democratic Party. Geographically, the northern half of the island largely supported statehood, while the south continued to support the Commonwealth status. Those who supported independence were dispersed all over the island. Ed Morales considers the number of people who support independence to be much higher than polls indicate. He says Puerto Ricans who want independence but vote for the major parties are called quote-unquote melons, because they believe one thing deep down, but outwardly they vote with the mainstream. Arturo Morales Carrion sums up the political situation in Puerto Rico like this, quote, "The partisan spectrum so far has demonstrated that there is little room for the extreme left. The battle is really for the control of a massive center of political opinion," unquote. In Southeast Asia, the Vietnam War was escalating in a major way. Prior to American involvement, the French army and Vietnamese guerrillas battled incessantly for control of the countryside. France refused to give up, but following the disastrous Battle of Dien Bien Phu, France lost all control of the country. Unfortunately, the people of Vietnam were still not free. The UN arbitrarily split their country down the middle, leaving a socialist North Vietnam and a capitalist South Vietnam. In spite of the UN's request to reunify, the South Vietnamese president refused to budge. He was backed by American military might, so when a rebellion, led by South Vietnamese peasants who were in support of unifying the country, spiraled into civil war, America sent their forces in the hundreds of thousands to support their oppression. 40,000 of these soldiers were Puerto Ricans, and once more hundreds would die while thousands would be maimed in the name of America. In total, 5 Puerto Ricans were posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for their sacrifices. Carlos James Lozada was a machine gunner attached to the 137th Airborne Brigade. During the Battle of Dak To, his unit came under heavy attack. Lozada rained hell on the enemy, killing at least 20 from atop the small hill on which he was positioned. He volunteered to hold off the enemy as they congregated on his position from 3 directions. He likely saved his unit from being overwhelmed and destroyed. Unfortunately, he was mortally wounded and soon died. Félix Conde Falcón was serving in Aptan Ho when his unit came upon a complex of bunkers. Falcón hopped onto the roof of one bunker and chucked grenades into the slits in the ceiling, killing all enemies inside. He repeated the dangerous process 2 more times before leading his men in an assault with a machine gun and then an M16 rifle. Before assaulting this final bunker, an unseen enemy killed him. Euripides Rubio was in Tainan province when his unit was attacked. He braved enemy fire in order to place himself in the center of the fight, at which point he distributed ammunition, gave aid to the wounded, and directed the fire of a leaderless squad. Air support was called in, but the smoke grenade intended to demarcate enemy positions was accidentally dropped amongst Rubio's men. He selflessly scooped up the grenade, and despite being severely wounded, he managed to throw the smoke grenade away from his men. He would soon die from his injuries, but his sacrifice saved hundreds of his own men from falling victim to friendly fire. Héctor Santiago Calón was serving as a mortarman in Quang Tri province when enemy units came upon his entrenchments. They launched a devastating assault, and in the mayhem, a single Vietnamese soldier got close enough to chuck grenades into the American foxhole. Realizing there was no time to try and throw the grenade back, Santiago Calón tucked the grenade into his own stomach and turned away from his comrades so as to shoulder the full blast. This killed him, but saved his unit. Humbert Roch Versace was taken prisoner in 1963, right at the beginning of America's involvement in Vietnam. He rapidly became the ad hoc leader of American POWs. He supported the men with encouraging messages and bolstered their spirit with popular songs. Continually tortured and put under duress, Versace's will refused to break. He attempted 4 separate escapes, but each failed because he was still recovering from 2 untreated bullet wounds. When he protested the treatment of American POWs to his guards speaking Vietnamese, they placed him in heavy irons and kept him away from all other prisoners. He refused to let up and was executed for it. In his last moments, he was heard singing God Bless America. He was the first member of the U.S. Army to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his time in captivity. Ed Morales says this quote-unquote dual nationalism was fostered in many Puerto Rican homes who had a military lineage. The war would end in 1975, but it would only bring more issues to the surface. At around the same time, OPEC began denying the West, specifically the United States, oil, and a fuel shortage began to grip the nation. This crisis especially affected Puerto Rico, whose burgeoning petrochemical plants began to close their doors en masse. In 1976, food stamps were introduced on the island, and the grim reality of the situation was laid bare. Over half the island's families applied for food stamps in order to maintain a regular diet. Fernando Picó says, quote, after the rapid rise in the cost of energy in 1973 to 74, the economic model based on the development of manufacturing faced serious problems, unquote. To alleviate the economic downturn the island was facing, the U.S. had the Internal Revenue Code amended. Now, companies could take the profits they made on the island and not pay taxes on them, because the profits were made in Puerto Rico and not in the United States. This new economic incentive did hold Puerto Rico afloat for a time, but the differences between GDP, the gross domestic product, and GNP, the gross national product, were shocking. Puerto Rico has one of the lowest GNP balances in the world. Only United States occupied Iraq outpaced the island, and this was only for a short time. By 1996, the profits generated by this tax amendment totaled more than $10.5 billion. Even with this astronomical increase in profits, the Puerto Rican citizens who were responsible for gathering these profits were not benefiting from them. Congress went on to abrogate the law that same year, causing private money to cease flowing to Puerto Rico altogether. In addition to an unsustainable economic situation, substance abuse, homelessness, and a rapid decrease in sugarcane harvesting ravaged Puerto Rico. As drug usage increased across the island, Fernando Picó asserts, quote, "The young addict was forced to steal or mug people in order to maintain a habit that was expensive because it was illegal," unquote. Increased crime rates hindered the growth of the tourist industry, and as the 1980s began, it was in serious decline. Poverty also forced many people out of their privately owned homes and into public housing. It did not help that the value and therefore the cost of private housing shot up on average by $40,000. Finally, the rise of the use of government food stamps can be attributed to the rapid decline in the sugar-growing sector. In 1984, only 96,000 tons of sugarcane were harvested, compared to over 1.2 million tons in 1950. Additionally, in 1984, over 400,000 families were part of the Nutritional Assistance Plan. Fernando Picó correctly asserts that until a valid solution is found to bring economic prosperity to the island once more, the only choice is to continue federal programs. Taking food away from poor people who cannot find a job will only breed revolutionary violence. As it stood, the island attempted to change its financial situation by converting the island's economy into one which was service-based. Due to this, university enrollment increased substantially, and the new service industry saw an explosion in cafe theater and poetry. As poverty abounded, some independentistas turned to violence to seek a redress of grievances for Puerto Rican rights. The Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, or FALN, were a militant group which was active in the United States and Puerto Rico. Its core members were disaffected people within the Puerto Rican diaspora. Ed Morales says FALN militancy was, quote, "directly impacted by racism, segregation, and social injustice in the United States," unquote. Another revolutionary group of a similar vein was Los Macheteros. They were responsible for numerous bombings around military bases in Puerto Rico and for planting bombs in the island's main financial district, the Milla de Oro, or the Golden Mile, in Hato Rey. The FALN and Los Macheteros, like the IRA in the Free State of Ireland, believed they had a right to wage war for their national sovereignty. Their first action was the targeted bombing of several buildings, which belonged to a litany of multinational corporations. Countless members of each group were arrested, the most high-profile of whom was Oscar Lopez Rivera, who had his sentence commuted by Barack Obama in early 2016. Ed Morales says, quote, "A large swathe, if not a majority, of Puerto Ricans supported them in their quest for freedom from U.S. imprisonment," unquote. By far the most famous incident involving independentistas was the Maravilla massacre. On July 15, 1978, two young militants, alongside an undercover detective, were en route to Maravilla Mountain, in the hopes of sabotaging a communications installation. The two militants were quickly surrounded by police and they surrendered themselves. Soon afterwards, both young men were dead, killed by police. PRPD claimed they were, quote, "trying to escape," unquote. But upon further investigation, a courageous young lawyer discovered that they were both executed by police and that several high-ranking officers had perjured themselves. It brought intense scrutiny to an already highly scrutinized police department and brought more support to the independentista cause. James Tobin, professor of Yale University, was brought in to find a solution to the flailing Puerto Rican economy in 1974. He believed the main problem was that Puerto Ricans worked under the minimum wage laws of the United States. He claimed these laws were an impediment to economic growth on the island. His complaints would be echoed in a 2015 report on the island, which suggested further wage cuts. Both reports failed to mention the effect these depressed wages would have on the island's population, nor the fact that Puerto Ricans were, in fact, U.S. citizens. Ed Morales concludes, quote, "Economic solutions must first consider the stability of U.S. capital investment, and Puerto Ricans' right to economic prosperity is secondary." Unquote. As the 1980s began, Congress became obsessed with reforming tax law. New reforms now barred Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia from being able to declare bankruptcy. One of the main proponents of this new reform was Strom Thurmond, a white supremacist who ran as a Dixiecrat in 1984. This all occurred during the Reagan Revolution, when taxes were cut on capital so that capital could invest heavily in the speculative bond market. The fact that Puerto Rico could no longer declare bankruptcy made it a cesspool for the very worst Wall Street had to offer. With no bankruptcy protections, Puerto Rico would be forced to pay back any loan or bond in full, regardless of their ability to pay. Besides this, the island offered triple tax exemptions for local, state, and federal taxes. Unfortunately, these profits never found their way into the community, as they were used exclusively to build tourist traps or invest in Puerto Rican bonds, which would then fund Puerto Rican government institutions and catapult the island further into debt. The Aguila Blanca heist, named after Jose Maldonado, was a meticulously planned robbery of a Wells Fargo in Connecticut. Members of Los Matacheros got jobs at the bank, then proceeded to steal over $5 million from the bank on September 12, 1983. Its date coincided with the birthday of Pedro Albizu Campos. For its time, it was the largest heist ever completed in America. The hunt for the alleged thieves spanned decades. Those captured were given as many as 65 years in prison. Filiberto Ojeda Rios refused to go quietly, and he fought officials with a handgun and Uzi submachine gun. His armed resistance resulted in the blinding of an FBI agent, and this convinced him that he wouldn't get a fair trial. He skipped his bail and went on the run for the rest of his life. In 2005, FBI agents finally tracked him down at his home in Hormigueros. What happened next is disputed. The FBI claims Ojeda began firing as the FBI approached. Ojeda's wife and his neighbor claim it was the FBI who began firing first. The likely reality was that FBI agents let loose a flashbang grenade before approaching Ojeda's home. Ojeda likely confused this for gunfire and sought to defend himself. After the FBI besieged his home, Ojeda said he would surrender to a local journalist, but this offer was rebuked by agents. The FBI utilized 2 separate negotiators for the standoff. This practice, in the words of the Inspector General in their official report, quote, did not comply with its own, the FBI's, policies regarding the integration of negotiators into the operations, unquote. Agents would not enter the house until the following day, where they found Ojeda dead, killed by a single gunshot wound through his lung. Autopsies revealed that he died of blood loss and could have been saved by EMTs if authorities reacted faster. another version of events put forward by the Puerto Rican Comisión de Derechos Civiles, a civil rights organization, states FBI agents callously allowed Ojeda to bleed out. Either way, Ojeda was dead, and another voice in support of an independent Puerto Rico was silenced. When Bill Clinton took office, he signed into law a bill which would phase out Section 936 of the tax code. This was done in the hopes of making America's tax system more efficient, but it coincided with the start of NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. This, more than anything, devastated Puerto Rico's middle-of-the-road position. Prior to NAFTA, Puerto Rico was the poorest quote-unquote state in the Union, outranking Mississippi and Alabama in terms of unemployment and intense poverty. However, this still put the island leagues above its Caribbean neighbors and Mexico. Now, companies had no reason to invest in Puerto Rico, since places like Mexico offered much lower wages to their workers and had few union protections. This alliance between finance capital and the government would bloom into a very profitable relationship for all parties involved, except, of course, the working citizens, who would be forced to foot the bill financially, physically, and emotionally. During this time, Puerto Ricans increasingly suffered from what David Harvey calls, quote, accumulation by dispossession, unquote. This centralized wealth into the hands of fewer and fewer multinational corporations, while public services were cut because they were supposedly inefficient. Under this system of economic subjugation, Puerto Ricans had to face the reality that they were a part of the global South and that they always have been. This term refers to the southern half of the globe, which is routinely dispossessed by quote-unquote Western powers for their own benefit. It is colonialism and imperialism with a new look. Western powers systematically disenfranchise the global South through their support of neoliberal economic policies which force countries within the United States' sphere of influence into debt spirals and severe austerity. This spiral affected Puerto Rico especially. No longer buoyed by Tax Code 936 and unable to seek international relief from associations like the IMF, all Puerto Rico's leaders could do to keep the island afloat was to borrow from Wall Street creditors. It became so bad that the Puerto Rican legislature was forced to pass the COFINA sales tax. This sales tax targeted the poorest Puerto Ricans, and over 50% of all the proceeds the tax generated went directly into the pockets of Wall Street creditors. Ed Morales says, quote, the Puerto Rican economy morphed from a failing welfare state to one wholly absorbed by advanced Wall Street risk avoidance mechanisms. By financing its growing debt with a sales tax, Puerto Rico would directly pass the debt burden onto the average consumer, unquote. Under this system of borrowing, cutting, still borrowing, and cutting again, poverty became rampant. As the 2010s began, Puerto Rico owed an astonishing $72 billion in debt. Now, it would be easy to place the blame on Puerto Rican leadership for allowing such a debt to accumulate. But when you consider this debt is largely built on interest and paying for basic services, the true insidious nature of Wall Street is revealed. In our series on the American labor movement, Links in the Chain, we discuss the reasons behind the 2008 financial crisis and the subsequent pain and suffering it caused for people across the globe. Then, too, working people were criticized for taking loans they would never be able to pay back. But how could a responsible creditor give a loan they knew was unpayable? And how could the government allow these institutions to exist and exploit citizens whom they themselves had thrown into unlivable circumstances, while also claiming to work in the people's interest? Politically, the 1990s were a period of pendulum politics on the island, in which each party had a chance to take power over successive elections. It began with the election of Pedro Rosello, whose son would eventually become governor. He was a member of the center-right NPP. He took a hard stance on drug usage, especially in the urban center of San Juan. Since the 1960s, drug traffickers from Colombia have used Puerto Rico as a stopover for smuggling cocaine into the United States. In several highly publicized police raids, public housing units which contained alleged drug dens were raided. Fernando Picó says, quote, "The result, however, was that the drug distribution centers, popularly called puntos, spread throughout the island. What had been largely a problem of the urban centers now became widespread." Unquote. As Rosello ineffectively tried to alleviate the drug issue on the island, several high-profile government scandals broke news, turning the ire of the masses onto Puerto Rican politicians. These same politicians who were supposedly hard on crime, when it came to drugs, were lining their own pockets with money from their campaign contributions. Another issue which pervaded Puerto Rican life was domestic violence. The issue is prevalent up through today, and it affects both men and women. A 2011 study suggests that PRPD, quote, "systematically discriminated against male victims," unquote. Women are attacked and assaulted much more often, usually by an intimate partner. A report in the mid-1990s claimed upwards of 13% of the island's female-identifying citizens experienced domestic violence. In the wake of Hurricane Maria and the COVID-19 pandemic, domestic violence was such an issue that the governor was forced to declare a state of emergency on the island. Additionally, the fight for the rights of 2S LGBTQIA+ individuals has become prevalent in recent decades, and the younger generations are leading the cause. Puerto Rico has some of the highest numbers of HIV/AIDS diagnoses within the United States' territory. Because of a false equivalency created between the homosexual community and HIV/AIDS diagnoses, research on how to treat the disease has been severely underfunded in many areas, including Puerto Rico, thus creating a substantial increase in transmission of the disease on the island. In spite of all this, the island has been given a quote-unquote fair rating from the Movement Advancement Project, or MAP, a website dedicated to tallying the level of repressiveness experienced by 2S LGBTQIA+ people in all 50 states and U.S. territories. Needless to say, there is still a long way to go before Puerto Ricans, regardless of their gender, orientation, or identity, are all equal in society and before the law. Another hot-button issue which gained serious traction during this time was the Peace for Valleques movement. For decades, the Valleques naval base was one of the largest in the Western Hemisphere. It controlled the small island chain of Valleques alongside vast tracts of Puerto Rican land. In the spring of 1999, a civilian on security detail, David Sanes Rodriguez, was killed by errant naval shell fire. His death sent shockwaves throughout the island, and a volcano of anger erupted against naval domination in southern Puerto Rico. Several prominent politicians who ranged across the political spectrum were arrested for their protestations. The battle for quiet on the islands of Valleques made headlines even in the United States. Besides Valleques, the Navy also chose to withdraw from their naval base in Ceiba. They, of course, did not pick up any of the debris they had left over several decades of occupation, which included exploded ordnances and possibly hazardous material. Replacing Rosello was Puerto Rico's first female governor, Sila Maria Calderón. Following her ineffectual governorship, Aníbal Acevedo Villa became governor. he wished to increase the number of PPPs, or public-private partnerships. Additionally, he wanted to diversify Puerto Rico's economy into one that was technologically savvy and focused on scientific developments. His administration was ultimately defined, however, by repeated rows with the legislature over the passing of a sales tax. Needless to say, scientific advancement did not come into play during his stint as governor. In the most infamous example, the legislature and executive failed to pass a budget for the 2005-2006 fiscal period, and as a result, the 1909 Olmstead Act went into effect, and the budget reverted to that of the 2004-2005 budget. 2008 was a contentious election year, rivaling the bitterest elections in the island's history. The PPD had been sputtering under Villa, and people had been pushing for a new referendum for the status of the island. As a result, Luis Fortuño became the governor. Ed Morales says Fortuño believed in, quote, law and order politics, unquote. 5 months after the election, Villa was indicted on 19 separate criminal charges, including using campaign donations to pay for his family vacations. He would be found innocent on all charges, though several of his aides were found guilty. Puerto Rican politics have maintained a stigma of corruption ever since. Fortuño, meanwhile, set about gutting the once healthy public industries of Puerto Rico. He declared a state of emergency, which granted him the ability to implement severe austerity measures. This included laying off over 20,000 Puerto Rican civil servants in 2009. Young people and students took to the streets in response to the layoffs. Police reacted quickly, employing tear gas and billy clubs on the protesters. In April of 2010, the protests started up again. This time it was a full-on student strike against the governor and his austerity. As Ed Morales says, this movement predated the Occupy Wall Street movement and inspired many aspects of those protests. In June, violence began in the Puerto Rican legislature when journalists who were staging a sit-in had their protests stormed by police. The journalists were thrown out of the hall and decided to continue their sit-in outside on the pavement. Police fired mace at point-blank range into the eyes and faces of the sitting protesters, many of whom were licensed journalists. Yulen Cruz, soon-to-be San Juan mayor, was amongst those attacked. The infamous riot squad apparently knew who Cruz was. She claims they said, quote, "This is for you, Carmen Yulín," and they started to hit me, unquote. Fortuño claims he sent in police after protesters began proclaiming, quote, "Tomar por fuerza el Capitolio," or take the capital by force. What students actually said was retomar el Capitolio, or retake the capital. Either way, extensive force was used on students at a peaceful sit-in, and this would set the tone for the next decade or more for those who wished to protest. Fortuño and his administration were failing to ease the economic burden on the island, and this was only exacerbated by the 2008 recession and the United States government's apathy. One of Fortuño's proposed solutions was gasoducto, a 92-mile natural gas pipeline which would have theoretically lowered energy costs, but it would have created a serious threat to the local ecology. Beyond this, Fortuño's best friend was the designer of the pipeline, and some voiced ethical concerns over this. Committed environmental activists were staunch in their opposition to the pipeline, and the effort to get it constructed proved too great. It set the stage for a much more dangerous entity known as PREPA, or the Puerto Rican Electric Power Authority. This entire time, PPD and NPP politicians were borrowing from Wall Street at a prodigious rate. This was done just to keep the island economically afloat. After 4 years of control over the island, Fortuño was replaced, and the revolving door continued to spin for the benefit of few and the outrage of many. Fortunio would find a new job right away at a law firm to which he awarded over $20 million in contracts to during his time as governor. Colonialism breeds corruption, and vice versa. Corruption has bled into every colonial government and country over time, and Puerto Rico is no exception. Ed Morales says, quote, "Corruption is inevitably a product of collaborating with and subjugating itself, Puerto Rico, to a colonial system of government," unquote. This corruption pervaded every level of financial transaction. This is how an island of 4 million comes to owe over 70 billion in debt. The new governor, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, attempted to fix the economic woes of the island through Law 71. This allowed certain public companies the ability to restructure their existing debt so as to prevent economic collapse. Hedge funds rallied to have the law's constitutionality challenged in the courts. Padilla insisted the island had every right to write its own bankruptcy law, while hedge fund managers said this law, quote, "breaks faith," unquote, with investors. Padilla attempted to fix numerous other issues relating to the economy, but his solutions always ended up being neoliberal and anti-worker. This led to more cuts and more talk of cuts, which lowered the economic viability of the island, as thousands were left jobless, forced to go on unemployment, and no longer spending money at the same rate. This was and is the ultimate failing of neoliberal economic policy. It is fraudulency made legal, and it has led to the exploitation of Puerto Ricans, citizens of the Global South, and impoverished Americans. Padilla's secretaries began touting Puerto Rico as the, quote, "Singapore of the West Indies," unquote. This was not because Puerto Rico had a high literacy rate, high ownership rates, and a record of low corruption. It was because corrupt Puerto Rican officials and Wall Street degenerates were willing to bend every rule and safeguard to encourage economic spending from private investors. They never tried to encourage spending on the island in order to stimulate growth from the bottom up. They cut, and they cut some more, but the debt kept spiraling out of control for some reason. Ann Kruger was brought in to quote-unquote save the day. She is an acclaimed economist from New York. Her report shed some light on what economists think is good for economies these days. She said Puerto Rico needed to shrink its government, lower the minimum wage, and trim federal entitlements. Her recommendations gave no thought to what this would mean for the average Puerto Rican. She never considered that trimming entitlements would mean 60% of the island would be affected. She never thought about what diminishing wages would mean to an island whose population was 40% under the poverty line. She did not give a damn that shrinking the government would mean increasing the number of unemployed, or that Puerto Rico was suffering from 13% unemployment already. It was not in her algorithm for success. I find it exceedingly strange that in order for capitalism to succeed, poor people must suffer and become destitute or die. There were many who began arguing against the debt from a moral perspective. Many activists and economists alike have called for part or all of the debt to be expunged, since it was acquired quote-unquote odiously. This principle had roots in American history. When America annexed Cuba, for example, it wiped the state's debts clean under the same quote-unquote odious debt argument. Activists pointed to the 100-year-old Jones Act, which was still the main piece of legislation by which the island was governed. It severely limited maritime trading between Puerto Rico and neighboring islands. This hurt producers as well as consumers, who were forced into a subservient role to the U.S. market. To quote-unquote save the island, Democrats rallied around Lin-Manuel Miranda, a playwright and actor, who beseeched Republicans to reach across the aisle and help Puerto Rico. As a result, Promesa was passed. Promesa is a court-appointed body of economists whose job it is to make sure Puerto Rico fulfills its debt obligations. This new unelected body would be the true rulers of Puerto Rico moving forward. Their policies would help push the island over the edge and force the people into a generation of poverty. Fiscal control boards are nothing new to America, but Puerto Rico's example is different. Never before had an entire territory been subjected to an unelected oversight board. In previous cases, financial boards were used to regulate local and city governments whose spending had gotten out of hand. Most famously, New York City had a financial oversight board in the 1970s. Next, Cleveland, Philadelphia, and even Washington, D.C. followed suit throughout the subsequent decades. Today, these boards function as a sort of middleman between the financial sector and the public sector. These forces have effectively moved past the classic power structure which once existed between workers and bosses. Maurizio Lazzarato explains this relationship, quote, has morphed into a leveraged battle between investors and consumers, unquote. The control board in Puerto Rico became known as La Junta and was composed of 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. Of these, 4 were Puerto Rican. Almost all of them had ties to the financial sector. In one instance, a Puerto Rican on this control board diverted $1 billion, which was originally intended to fix Puerto Rican infrastructure, into, quote, financial transactions that were intended to bolster the island's credit rating, but which became tied up in the issuance of billions in new debt, unquote. This fueled renewed protests against the government and Puerto Rico's poverty. People began actively calling for an audit on the $72 billion in debt. Protests like those which occurred in 2010 and 2011 exploded across the island in 2016. Tens of thousands took to the streets once more in the hopes of securing some level of economic independence. Specifically, they took to the streets to prevent the invocation of Title III of the Promesa Act, which promised a new form of bankruptcy hearings which would have further benefited the creditors and vulture capitalists. In response to the protests, Ricardo Rossello denounced the vandalism which had been reported, lumping together the vandals with the majority of peaceful marchers who had nothing to do with the vandalism. The island's ACLU chapter came to the defense of protesters, alleging the use of tear gas, rubber bullets, and excessive force on peaceful marchers. Taking it a step further, the Banco Popular filed a lawsuit against 42 named individuals, but also, quote, unknown demonstrators, unquote. Human rights lawyers rapidly cried foul and claimed this lawsuit was frivolous and part of a, quote, disturbing pattern, unquote, of targeted litigation against known organizers and activists. Next, Rossello passed several laws which targeted protesters specifically. His administration increased fines and penalties for demonstrators who wore masks. He made it illegal to obstruct construction sites, and most tellingly, he imposed a $30,000 fine on anyone who was found, quote, interfering with tourist activities, unquote. A few days after these announcements, almost 200 public schools were shuttered as a result of government downsizing. This especially affected the poorest children on the island, whose families had to scramble to enroll their children in schools which were very far away. Next, they claimed union contracts needed to be renegotiated. Then, they said government employees would have to be furloughed for 2 days out of the month. This was a bridge too far, as many inside the administration took exception with this move. Rossello promised to remove the furlough motion, but La Junta had other ideas. They brought litigation against Rossello's government in order to push the furloughs through, against the will of the majority of Puerto Ricans, as well as the governor. Unsurprisingly, new voices began clamoring for independence from America, and the Puerto Rican Independence Party has been steadily rising in popularity ever since. Besides independence, Statehood had always been a looming second option for those frustrated by the Commonwealth status. They actively courted both sides of the political debate within the United States in the hopes of gaining allies in Congress to advocate their party's statehood agenda. This began as early as the 1970s with certain NPP politicians arguing that statehood would be beneficial to the poor. In the late 1990s, this was followed up on with the Young Bill, or the United States Puerto Rico Political Status Act. This act called for an official plebiscite on the island's status question, allowing for either statehood, independence, or retention of the Commonwealth system. It passed the House easily but died in the Senate, when the reality of what Puerto Rican statehood would mean economically for the rest of the country frightened Republicans. This meant the only way Puerto Rico could gain support for a plebiscite was through political lobbying. In 1998, for example, the Puerto Rican government spent over $4 million on lobbying efforts in Washington when it could have used the money to take care of the most needy. Ed Morales says this amount of money, quote, was more than the combined sum of what Denver, Los Angeles, Miami-Dade County, and Chicago spent on lobbying, unquote. Enter Ralph Reed, an influential conservative thinker who was largely responsible for terms like drain the swamp, as well as economic neoliberal policies which pervade present-day government and economics. He began calling for a plebiscite on the status question of Puerto Rico in the 1990s. As a result, the 1998 plebiscite was held. It was important in one respect only. The choice none of the above won a majority of votes with 50.3%. This choice was favored by those who supported an enhanced Commonwealth, which would keep the political relationship the same but allow for more rights for Puerto Ricans. Another factor which contributed to the muddled nature of the 1998 referendum was a new generation of left-wing pro-statehood thinkers. They argued for statehood from a radical leftist perspective, seeing it as the best way to bring about social change. This movement possesses many similarities to the old-school Socialist Party, which campaigned alongside Republicans under similar principles. Puerto Rican nationalists disparaged this movement for the same reasons they disparaged the Socialist Party of yesteryear. The push for more plebiscites when things looked down was a constant feature of many NPP governments. They attempted to use these plebiscites to show they had popular support, understanding that they could never turn Puerto Rico into a state without the assent of Congress. In 2012, the most striking and controversial plebiscite took place. Its final tallies were seen in some respects as a total win for the NPP and statehood option. Overall, 62% of Puerto Ricans claimed they favored statehood, but this was not the entire story. The ballot options and the ballot process was incredibly confusing and controversial. Puerto Ricans were asked two separate questions. The first, are you satisfied with the current territorial status? Of which 54% of Puerto Ricans voted no. Then it gave voters three options to choose from. These included statehood, independence, and a third confusing option called a, quote, sovereign free associated state, unquote, a hybrid of Commonwealth and independentista theories. Of these choices, 61% of Puerto Ricans chose statehood, while 33% chose the sovereign free associated state, and only 6% supported outright independence. With such a confused list of choices, many PPD politicians urged their supporters to boycott the plebiscite or to enter a blank vote. If one counts these blank votes, the pro-statehood option only receives 45% of the vote. If you counted blank votes along with sovereign free associated state votes, these options gained a 51% majority. So it's pretty clear the population remains deadlocked in their opinions. before a new plebiscite could occur, Hurricanes Irma and Maria arrived on the island. Throughout this period, Puerto Rico suffered from many hurricanes, each varying in intensity and damage. However, Maria was something altogether different. Maria missed, or only clipped, many of the other islands on its path of destruction, causing a total of 84 casualties and almost $2 billion in damage throughout the Caribbean. Puerto Rico, however, was hit directly, and the already crumbling electrical infrastructure on the island was absolutely devastated. The storm dumped as much as 35 inches of rain onto some parts of the island. Wind gusts after landfall were reported at over 115 miles per hour. 300,000 homes were destroyed and another 400,000 structures were severely damaged. In Toa Baja, a storm surge caused waters to rise 6 feet in a matter of minutes, trapping many residents. Every single person on the island was without power. Landslides ravaged the countryside. Tens of millions of coffee trees were eviscerated. Agriculturalists estimate it will take, quote, 10 to 15 years, unquote, for the coffee industry in Puerto Rico to recover 15% of its pre-Maria production. It is the 10th most intense storm the Atlantic has ever recorded, while also being the 4th most damaging, causing upwards of $90 billion in damages. A week after the hurricane, 95% of the island had no power and less than half the population had access to tap water. The new United States President, Donald J. Trump, and his administration were in crisis mode. They deployed military National Guard units to assist in relief efforts. At an impromptu press conference, Trump sat down with the governor and other influential Puerto Ricans. Ed Morales says Trump, quote, bullied the governor into admitting that there were only 4 casualties, when in fact the bodies were already piling up at morgues and for those less fortunate in people's backyards, unquote. Next, Trump hastily entered a local church where he infamously tossed a bunch of paper towels to the citizens whose lives had nearly been destroyed. The Trump administration and their lackeys in Puerto Rico doubled down on this false death count for months. Only Yulín Cruz, mayor of San Juan, was brave enough to call out the sluggish response by the federal government. In the face of an apathetic and dubious government, the Puerto Rican people banded together and showed an amazing amount of communal solidarity. They returned to a world without electricity. They supported one another, delivering gas and food to elderly neighbors and creating ad hoc construction and clearance teams to remove debris from the roads. Many considered leaving the island temporarily or for good, and many who had family in the United States made the trip as soon as they were able. Lobbying efforts for relief were slow and needed to be weighed with relief efforts taking place in Florida and Texas. The non-voting Puerto Rican representative of Congress lobbied for aid, which would total anywhere from $15 billion to $30 billion. Unfortunately, the island only received about $4 billion from the federal government, while it was not allowed to receive aid from foreign countries because of the ancient Jones Act. Enter Elon Musk. Ed Morales says he, quote, sent hundreds of Powerball battery packs to capture energy generated by solar panels. This distracted attention from those who had been developing solar energy on the island before the hurricane, unquote. This whole time, Trump and his administration scolded the Puerto Rican people for daring to question the official number of dead, which somehow stood only at 17. Trump said, quote, I hate to tell you that you've thrown our budget a little bit out of whack, because we've spent a lot of money on PR, and that's fine. We've saved a lot of lives, unquote. He continues, quote, if you look at every death is horror, but if you look at a real catastrophe like Katrina and you look at the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds that died, and you look at what happened here with really a storm that was just totally overpowering, nobody's ever seen anything like this, unquote. Independent journalists scoured morgues and hospitals, seeking the truth of the real number of those who died. They found these places filled to the brim with human corpses, who all died directly or indirectly as a result of Maria. The Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Beth Israel Diakonis Medical Center report claims the number of dead to be as high as 4,645. In late August of 2018, the George Washington University conducted a study of their own and revised this number to 2,975, including many missing, bringing the overall total to 3,059. Trump, meanwhile, was worried about the bottom line. He actively considered selling Puerto Rico or, quote-unquote, switching it with Greenland, and reportedly said, quote, Puerto Rico was dirty and the people were poor, unquote. Maria affected all aspects of Puerto Rican life. Obviously, it affected the day-to-day to which Puerto Ricans had grown accustomed. But it also accelerated violent social confrontations and the radicalization of young people. Many on the island blame the hurricane and its tragic aftermath for the rise in gender-related violence and the subsequent state of emergency relating to it. One aspect of Puerto Rican life which was seriously damaged was the healthcare industry, which suffered immensely in the face of the storm. Additionally, tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans who left the island began to slowly return, or they found new homes in the United States. Today, the Great Migration mostly trends south, with many Puerto Ricans finding a home in Florida or Texas. Just before Maria, the embattled Rossello administration pushed for another plebiscite on the status question. The PPD urged its supporters to boycott the election outright, and as a result, statehood won a staggering 97% of the vote. Following Maria, the sentiments for change accelerated into hyperdrive. The PPD was viewed as antiquated, and many considered the Commonwealth to be an abject failure. Independent supporters grew in number, finally unafraid to voice a sentiment which was violently suppressed during their parents' childhoods. The older generation still supported the PPD, but on the whole, statehood became the most common choice amongst islanders who saw no other solution to the precarious state of affairs. As a result, in spite of accusations of corruption, the NPP and its candidates have held office since the hurricane. As the island slowly recovered, a scandal would depose the Rossello governorship. Known as Telegram Gate, the scandal involved the leaking of private conversations between members of the Rossello administration that occurred within the app Telegram. They were vulgar, racist, homophobic, and misogynistic to the extreme. In one exchange, Rossello called San Juan's mayor a puta and made homophobic comments about pop singer Ricky Martin. In another exchange, those in the chat shared confidential information on a non-secure server. These three damning instances were just the tip of the iceberg. In the most shocking example of how little the government cares about those it's supposed to serve, members of the Rossello administration joked about the death toll and poked fun at those so destitute that they were forced to bury their loved ones in their backyards. Rossello did nothing to stop this quote-unquote bro culture, as he described it, later claiming he was working non-stop, and he used the chat to, quote, blow off steam, unquote. At first, he said he wouldn't resign, but then the protests started. It became an island-wide movement to remove a cold, unfeeling bureaucrat. The protests were highly successful, and in a matter of weeks, Rossello announced his resignation. Pedro Pierluisi replaced him. He served for a grand total of 5 days before the Puerto Rican legislature challenged his appointment's constitutionality and demanded a new government be formed. Wanda Vázquez Garced, would lead this new government. In late December of 2019, Puerto Rico was struck by a 6.4 magnitude earthquake. Aftershocks from the quake were intense and occurred into the new year. It caused over $3 billion in damage and claimed the lives of 4 people. In the quake's aftermath, emergency supplies were found to be hoarded by government officials in a warehouse in San Juan. This led to renewed outrage and protests against the government. Come election time, Garced would fail to win her own party's primary, and Pedro Pierluisi would become governor for the second time, this time legally. COVID-19 arrived on the island in March of 2020. As I write this, over 4,000 Puerto Ricans have been killed by the disease, which the Trump administration did little to nothing to mitigate. As we enter the modern day, Puerto Rico still faces a plethora of challenges, all of which have been brought about by inept government leadership, both on and off the island. For the first time since the first 100 years of Spanish colonization, the island is losing population. More and more young people and skilled laborers are leaving the island in droves. Only recently has the island's government begun to pay off the tens of billions of dollars owed to Wall Street's succubi. For the foreseeable future, Puerto Ricans can expect more austerity and less empathy toward the plight of the poorest and most maligned. As the NPP rises in the polls, the question remains, is statehood the best solution for Puerto Rico? At the end of the day, the decision should be left to Puerto Ricans who live on the island and who would be most affected by the outcome of this question either way. Unfortunately for the island and its future, it is controlled by politicians who wax poetic about freedom of speech and human liberties until it's time to walk the walk. This goes double for private and corporate interests who have more control over the island than ever before. Puerto Rican history, since its earliest recording, has been steeped in blood, racism, and the perseverance of a people who will not allow the most difficult of battles to bring them down or take them out. Puerto Rico, for all intents and purposes, remains a colony, exploited by American interests. In spite of this, Puerto Rico remains steadfast and loyal to its traditions and its culture. Today, Puerto Rican culture and music are being glorified and appropriated in many sectors beyond the island. Liberals seem to finally have noticed that the island exists, though most still don't know it's a United States territory, and they exploit the popularity of people like Lin-Manuel Miranda and Jennifer Lopez to push their own agendas. Puerto Rico is an essential puzzle piece, which the American government continuously claims doesn't fit. But this has never stopped the United States from exploiting the island and its people for their own benefit. When they deny the hardships they have inflicted upon the people in Puerto Rico, they deny complicity in the destruction of the island, its economy, and its people. If America truly wants to be a superhero as they believe they are, they should stop trying to rewrite the sins of their past and instead take accountability and step up to find a solution to the problems they've created. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Turning Tides. This is the final episode of our Puerto Rico series, and I hope you've all enjoyed it. With that in mind, Melissa and I will be taking a much-needed break from the podcast, but worry not, dear listener, we will return. I'm very happy to announce that when we do return, we will be starting a brand new series covering the rise and fall of the decadent, grand Mughal Empire. I'm your host, Joseph Pascone, and I hope all of you have a fantastic day.
If you like what you heard today, you can support us by donating on PayPal at Turning Tides Podcast 1. Thanks for the support, and thank you for listening. If you like what you've heard, we'd really appreciate it if you take the time to rate and review Turning Tides on whatever platform you use to listen, and share the show on social media. It really helps us to bring the show to more listeners. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to everyone for listening. We'd also like to say thank you to Movo Photo. We use their sound equipment for this podcast, as well as all of our other projects at AntiKs Entertainment. They make great equipment at great prices, and we really appreciate that they make content creating so accessible for indie creators like us. Check them out on social media at Movo Photo, MOVOPHOTO. Thank you again.